This is one of Egypt's greatest rulers, Amenhotep III. This is his giant granite bust at the British Museum in London, depicting him as a slightly chubbier elder statesman. And here he is on a wall relief, back again in his youthful days, viewable at the Louvre in Paris. This, on the other hand, is what famous forensic reconstructor Cicero Moraes thought he actually looked like. So, why do modern reconstructions of the pharaohs often ignore these to give us this? If you've ever asked that question, then you're not alone. Check out these reactions to Moraes' version of Amenhotep. Agreed. But are these reconstructions the final word? Trill Black and the Kush to Compton movement asked ancient Egyptian historian and reconstruction enthusiast Andrew King to wade in on the issue. Now, Andrew isn't just any old Joe Schmo when it comes to reconstructions. Andrew has peer-reviewed papers on forensic digital reconstructions and runs the King's Monologue channel, racking up millions of views across YouTube, TikTok and Instagram, just for his uber-realistic reconstructions of the pharaohs alone. He pointed out a few technical terms forensic reconstructors and Egyptologists are deathly afraid of, and just how their desire to run away from these terms lead to these Frankenstein pharaohs.
Dolichocephaly is essentially an expression of long-headedness, for want of a better word, where essentially the head is longer than it is wide. Okay, and we're looking for a head that's, notably longer than it is wide. In the black community, we essentially call it a peanut head or a hook head, or there's lots of different things that you might be called when you got this longish, narrowish head. And it's something that ancient Egyptian skulls are essentially renowned for. They don't all possess it, but it certainly is the vast majority when it comes to ancient Egyptian skulls. We know this because a study was done in the I want to say 80s. I think it was 80s, 85 by Raymond Dart. I could be wrong with that date, but I think it was the 80s by Raymond Dart, where he measured 2,761 skulls, and I think the rate of dolichocephaly was like well over 70%. And even the mesotecephalic skulls, which is kind of like, that's the middle. So you got dolichocephaly, then you got brachycephaly. Those are the two ends of the spectrum, and then in the middle you got mesotecephalic skulls. And even those ones were more weighted towards the dolichocephaly. And I'm mesotecephalic, by the way. I'm not dolichocephalic myself. So what you have is a huge bias towards basically African rates of dolichocephaly, because only African populations will possess dolichocephaly at those rates. It's not that dolichocephaly doesn't appear in Europeans or Eurasians, but it's just that it doesn't appear anywhere near those rates. So when it does appear, it's relatively rare. Also, to put on top of that as well, the type of dolichocephaly expressed by the ancient Egyptians is specifically African. The length of the head in comparison to the width and the low vault. So Africans, when they express dolichocephaly, it's not like a really tall head. It's a relatively low vault, and the reason the vault is low is because we have that extended, I'm going to use another technical term here, that's occipital, which is the back of the head. We have a kind of like a pokey out occipital region. So when we express dolichocephaly, it's got kind of like the back of our head pokes out, whereas in amongst Eurasians, when they express dolichocephaly, they tend to have kind of like a pokey front of head, if that makes sense, and their head still looks kind of squarish, if that makes sense. When it comes to like I was saying, when it comes to the head shape of the ancient Egyptians, it falls right in line with African populations, particularly those African populations along the Nile. So you see it really strongly amongst groups like, Maasai, the Kalenjin, Yoruba have it as well in spades. Yoruba have it about 72%. And the way we express it is exactly the same way that the ancient Egyptians express it. So there's a a very it's like, logic points towards the ancient Egyptians, just like with every other aspect, just being a locally black population, because they just have the the local traits that black populations do. And just to kind of like add on top of that as well, you don't see these kind of rates in modern Egypt, and that's what the argument will be. They'll say, oh, we're their descendants, we have the genetics, but it's kind of like, but you're missing all of the anthropometrics. The maxillo, or the maxillary area, is your upper jaw. So that's basically the area between the bottom of your nose and your lower jaw. So that's kind of your upper jaw area. So that's called the maxillary. And then your lower jaw is called the mandible. So if we're talking about facial extension, then really probably what we're talking about are two things. We're talking about prognathism, which I know you'll know what that means, and that's that kind of when the jaw protrudes ahead of your zygomatic, of your kind of like cheek area. So your jaw kind of like is forward in comparison to your cheek structure. That's a very, very African trait. Okay, so that's a very naturally African trait. A lot of African people will have it. Now, once again, it's not exclusive, because Africans are so phenotypically diverse. We can be orthognathic, which is when you're essentially flat front of face, and we can be retrognathic, and that's where the jaw actually recedes. All of those are perfectly natural and normal expressions of phenotype in Africa. However, prognathism is very, once again, weighted towards the African community. It's rare to see it, or at least to see a strong application of prognathism outside of Africans. They will call it they will normally come up with some kind of disability, to explain away prognathism when it occurs outside of the African community. So we've got prognathism as one of the things that expresses itself. But then we've also got another trait, which is probably less spoken about, and that's that extended maxillary region. So essentially, that top lip region in Africans tends to be quite large. That's a common trait. Europeans can have really, really tiny maxillary regions. That kind of space between the bottom of their nose and their lower jaw can be really, really small, hence the tiny top lips. Whereas Africans would tend to have a more extended maxillary region. Now, once again, it's not exclusive, because if you go to populations like Ethiopians in particular, in fact, very strongly in amongst the Habesha tend to have quite small maxillary regions. But I would say, broadly speaking, most Africans have an extended maxillary region when you compare it to Eurasian populations. So zygomatic, that's your cheek area, okay? And you kind of have, that expresses itself in two ways. You've got two bones, really. You've got the zygomatic major, which is the side of the side part, so your cheek that faces outwards, yeah? And then your zygomatic minor is your cheek that faces forward, faces in front of you, yeah? The difference that you can find between Eurasian and, once again, African populations is that it's very common amongst Africans to have a rounded zygomatic minor. That is the front of face having a rounded or a convex appearance. This is what gives us that nature's collagen look. Okay, we have that. Yeah. We have that natural. We're a naturally cheeky people. Okay, it's one of the things that keeps our faces looking young, and this is why Eurasians tend to like their Botox injections.
Yes.
And they always look a bit weird. You can always tell when a Eurasian's had Botox, because they don't naturally have that rounded front of face, that rounded zygomatic. If an African was to have Botox, you probably wouldn't notice, because it's a very natural look for us to have a rounded zygomatic minor. So that's one of the things. And this is one I bring this up actually have you seen that reconstruction that Elizabeth Darnes did of KV 35 younger lady as Nefertiti? I think I called her a I can't remember, a budget Kardashian or something like that. I roasted it. It's just horrible reconstruction. they tried to make her Nefertiti. By the way, KV35 younger lady isn't Nefertiti, but that's an aside. The point being is that KV35 younger lady has really pronounced zygomatic minor. That is the front area of the cheek, really rounded, very African cheeks. So when they try to make her look white, she just looks like a white woman with Botox. So look at the maxilla region. Remember I was telling you earlier about that extended region that black people have. So can you see how she looks really gaunt and gormless?
Yeah, it looks
yeah, yeah. She's kind of so what's going on? That's because she has a extended maxillary region, which is very normal for Africans, because we'll fill up half of that space with a very fleshy top lip. Okay. Do you know what I mean? That's what half of that space is supposed to be taken up with a naturally voluminous top lip.
I see.
Yeah. So this is why she just looks kind of like, ooh, you know, looks really long. And then, like I said, you can have a look at the cheeks. You could see they've tried to smooth them down, but you can't hide how pronounced that, you know, her zygomatic region is. She has, you know, high pronounced cheekbones, which is a very regional African trait. So essentially, yeah, when you take an African skull and you try and plaster, you know, I'm going to say white features on top of it, this is what you get. You just get something that doesn't look like it ever was a real human being. I think I always mention Nydia Senegal. She did a reconstruction of KV35 younger lady that was a lot nicer, because she just kind of like respected what she saw. So overjet and overbite, you might as well just call these East African teeth.
Right.
Yeah, you might as well just call it East African teeth. So this is so overjet is when your top row of teeth kind of angle in front of your bottom row of teeth, so they push ahead. So basically when you smile, your top teeth, in fact mine do that as well, my teeth overjet, your top teeth are in front of your bottom teeth. I guess everyone's teeth does that, but when it's done at an acute angle, it's called overjet. Okay. And then when overbite is when your top teeth go over, as in over and downwards over your lower jaw. So it's kind of like so your bite is your teeth kind of coming together, but an overbite is when the top row of teeth are over your bottom row of teeth, basically.
Right.
So combined, overjet and overbite kind of just give you what people kind of maybe say is kind of like buck teeth, so to speak. And once again, it's not always something that is an apparent kind of like physical problem. In fact, a majority of black people are overjet, a majority, but we have large teeth, I would say large lips, or thick and full lips, to compensate for the fact that we're overjet. It's a dominant trait in black people to be overjet. It's not a big deal. It's just a part of our facial makeup, so to speak.
So we've got these terms. Are these technical terms that describe black physiognomy, are they followed as a rule when people are trying to generally reconstruct these faces?
When you have that approach where you're going to say, I've seen this and this means the person is black, I think that's risky. Do you understand what I mean?
Okay.
We kind of like, you can't do that. What you have to do is take a measured approach and then start to deal with probabilities. Okay. Right. And probabilities will get you much closer to the truth and away from kind of any emotional position. So this is kind of what I tried to do when I did that documentary. You know, a lot of people do this approach of what race were the ancient Egyptians. I think it's a stupid question, if I'm going to be totally honest with you, because you're talking about a civilization that spans several thousands of years with several scores of ethnicities along the gnomes. At least that's what I believe. I believe you had loads of different ethnicities, but all of these ethnicities were native African ethnicities. Okay, native black, but they were different. There were different ethnicities and different groupings of people along the Nile over a long period of time. You know, so we would have had loads and loads of kind of like, you know, movement, change, change of leadership, change of demographic. And broadly speaking, yes, we know the ancient Egyptians were black, but it's a very broad and kind of unsatisfactory question, which is why I prefer to say, okay, let's take one ancient Egyptian that we all know who was a king, like Tutankhamun, yeah, and let's look at all of the evidence. Okay, let's look at all the evidence that we've got. We've got craniometric evidence, you know, in terms of, you know, the shape of his skull, which is, you know, unequivocally African. Okay, cool. So that gives him an 85% chance of being African. Okay, let's also look at, you know, his dental makeup. You know, he's got overjet, he's got overbite, he's got typical East African teeth. Okay, then let's add another 60% to that 90 something percent that we already have. Let's also look at his genetic data, his results that clustered him as being, you know, 94%, you know, probability of being a match to Great Lakes Africans. Okay, now putting these ratios alongside each other, it's getting a bit ridiculous. You know, let's look at the anthropometric proportions that he presents us with. Okay, he has super negroid limb proportions. In fact, he sits right in the middle of the, you know, of the negroid ratio, or the negro ratio, as it was quoted by Robbins. He sits right in the middle of it, in that you can calculate his limb proportions perfectly using the negro equation. So he sits right in the middle of that. Okay, so he's got negroid limbs, negroid skull, negroid genetics. At this point, you kind of go, okay, can we at least say that this was a black boy? Is that fair? Can we at least put the argument about Tutankhamun's race to bed and say he's definitely a black boy based on all of the data that we have? Can we do that? I think we have enough data to do that.
Now, in the first few minutes of Andrew's explanation, he mentioned ancient Egyptian genetics as well as modern Egyptian genetics. And just now, he made the bold claim on King Tut's genetics being aligned with Great Lakes Africans. They live way down here, around the Great Lakes region of southeastern Africa, in countries like Ethiopia, Rwanda, Uganda, and many others. Keep watching for a mind-blowing expose on that. But first, after that incredible analysis of history's most famous boy king, Tutankhamun, I asked Andrew whether he thought public reaction to Cicero Moraes' reconstruction of Amenhotep III was harsh.
I don't think they're harsh at all. I don't think they're harsh. The funny thing is, so obviously you kind of been following, you've watched a few of my videos, so you know that me and this reconstruction artist are in kind of direct contact. I actually believe that he made this reconstruction in response to the reconstruction that I did of Amenhotep III before him, because he has a habit of releasing reconstructions very soon after I've done them. But anyway, me and him have had quite extensive back and forths, and yeah, it's just a horrible reconstruction. Let's be honest with you, you know, it's absolutely horrendous. It pays no respect whatsoever. It's actually disrespectful, if I'm going to be quite frank. It's a disrespectful reconstruction. It's disrespectful to the artwork. It's something that you'd never see this in any. This is akin to taking a photograph of Queen Elizabeth, yeah, a young Queen Elizabeth, and then going and getting a woman from South Sudan and doing a reconstruction and saying, yeah, this is what Queen Elizabeth II actually looked like. You know, it's a joke. You know, it's actually insulting.
Ooh, controversial or not? Okay, so skin color aside, what's the excuse for Amenhotep III being depicted with full lips by his countrymen, only for Moraes several thousands of years later to make him into a geriatric with badly fitted dentures? Is there any truth to the allegations that the great pharaoh had, quote, bad dental hygiene?
Yeah, so Is this correct?
What you'll see is that Amenhotep III has had it's clearly nothing to do with dental hygiene because he has an actual hole in the front of his face, okay, where you can see someone posthumously, obviously, has basically just taken a hammer to his front teeth. Now, this has had the double effect of A, getting rid of all of that overjet and overbite that we speak about, okay, and B, kind of reducing the look of his prognathism. So you can see that in there. Just look at the side view and the front view. Can you see that big hole at the front of his teeth? That's not bad dental hygiene. That happened. That didn't happen during his life. That happened afterwards. Someone's gone at that mummy with a hammer. So for them to declare that he had bad dental hygiene is absolutely ridiculous. You can also see that the lower jaw has been jutted back slightly. It should be slightly forward from where it is. And even that image is being tilted. So I actually corrected this image when before I did my reconstruction to give a good look at what his skull should look like. So this is just a rebuilt Amenhotep III's skull, and it's explained in the paper, but I had to do a few kind of fixes to what Cicero did in his reconstruction. So he did a few things. The first thing he did, and you can do the comparison if you want to the skull that he shows, but the first thing he did is he made the mandible, which is the lower jaw, he just made it smaller. I don't know why. He just reduced its size or he jutted it backwards. But can you see how now it looks slightly retrographic, i.e. it looks like it's pushed back? Can you see that? That's deliberate. He's done that deliberately because that's a kind of like more common European phenotypic trait as opposed to having it level. He also, and he says it in his paper, made no effort or attempt whatsoever to rebuild the front teeth that were missing. He left them out because then that presents the teeth as flat. And you can see on my one, I built them back to show the kind of like overjet, overbite, and that kind of maxillary tilt.
Hold the presses. So what you're saying here, the image on the left-hand side is his attempts to reconstruct the so-called bad dental hygiene. And what he's done in doing that is he's flattened it.
Yeah, or he's just kind of like ignored. In fact, his looks is funny. His teeth look flatter than the teeth than the skull with missing teeth. I don't know how that's possible.
Right.
You just know what I mean? Like, so he's just done a whole job there.
So you can see the trajectory. He can see the trajectory that the mandible is going in, and he just ignores that and he flattens it. Wow.
Exactly. And he can kind of like, essentially no one's got to check him on that, because that's the one thing in Egyptology is you can whiten as much as you want and you won't get any pushback. Now, the other thing that's very notable, and this is the most notable, is I want you to take a look at the spinal column, the way he's presented the spinal column. Now, can you see how it kind of like curves outwards towards the back of the neck? So the center of your spinal column is kind of like the center of your inner ear. That's kind of where it would start. Okay, and can you see how it kind of like curves outwards? That is something that is unnatural and doesn't happen in any human being. Okay, the spinal column convexes. Okay, in other words, it curves more towards the front of your throat, so it should go in a kind of a C shape, not a D shape like he's got it here. Now, you might think, well, that's a little bit thingy. Why are you even mentioning that? He's done that deliberately because he wanted the spine to be closer to the back of the head. What is he trying to hide? Let me ask you that question.
Dolichocephaly.
Exactly.
I can see that.
Exactly. He's trying to hide the dolichocephaly. So by moving the spine back, and I mean he's moved the spine back here about 2 inches from where it should be. Ridiculous, yeah? Because he wants to hide the fact that Amenhotep III, like all Africans, had a rounded bean head at the back.
Wow.
He didn't want that to show. So he's pushed the spine back as close as he can, and then he can kind of present it like this flat back head European. because this is what we're used to seeing with Eurasians, this flat back of the head. Now you can see from that skull that Amenhotep III did not have a flat back of head. You can see that he had a rounded, peanut-y shaped African back of head. But he didn't want that presented in his reconstruction, which is why he opted for that.
I'm speechless. I'm it's not that I'm haven't got questions to follow up, but right now I'm speechless. That's amazing. And this is your paper?
Yeah. This is on the website, but it's the same paper. So this is that image you had earlier alongside other Amenhotep III artwork, and then that's a man from afar, and that's my reconstruction. And you can see just how naturally they all sync.
Mm-hmm.
You know, not much. You know, there's not much stretching or kind of like of the imagination you have to do to get there. This kind of just shows the different phenotypes that you can see present. These are all Rwandans, by the way, but I won't go into that right now. This is the original skull, so you can see it. Okay.
Yep.
And it's not closed. So when I did mine, I had to close the mouth. But you can see how he's just basically made the jaw smaller. He just ignored it. You can see it's visibly smaller here on his one. You can see the lower jaw. He just made it smaller so he can make it look retrographic and finish it.
And he closed it.
Yeah, and he made no attempt to build back where the front of the teeth had been knocked out. Okay. And you can see the spine, what it's doing naturally. Okay. It's doing that kind of like C shape as it should be naturally doing, giving you that nice protruding back of head, which he entirely got rid of. And then I show you, this is my one built back, and you can see how I've just followed the natural contours to show you exactly what the skull should have looked like when it was built back. Yeah, so he did the same thing with KV55, another skull with a quite strong rear protrusion, quite a low vault, quite a long skull. And you can just see it doesn't even look like the same skull by the time he's done with it. He's tilted it. Yeah. And you can just see the way he's done that once again to introduce retrographic, you know, to reduce, you know, KV55 is a very prognathic skull. Okay, very prognathic in that the lower jaw protrudes quite far forward when it's rendered properly and when it's oriented properly. And you can see he's managed to get rid of all of that and make it retrographic. You know, so this is and I just did this to prove that he does this all the time. It's not like he's doing it once. He does it with every reconstruction. So he knows exactly what he's doing to get the outcome that he's after.
Let's be fair. Nobody really knows what the motives of Mr. Morais and other digital reconstructors are when it comes to their work. But what is fair to remark upon are clear patterns. Patterns Andrew draws our attention to in his numerous demonstrations and YouTube videos. But another pattern is a weird doubling down when clear problems with skin color in these reconstructions are pointed out. The ancient Egyptians were a people of color, black and blackish to dark brown Africans, not Middle Easterners or whatever else modern authorities wish to reclassify them as. The historical witness of numerous Greek, Roman and later Arabic sources are clear on this. Even the infamous Zahi Hawass, the real-life Indiana Jones, admits as much. But when challenged by Andrew in an academic peer-reviewed paper about the color of his Amenhotep, Mr. Morais didn't outright deny this historical fact. Instead, using a Photoshop color picker, he bizarrely claimed his version of Amenhotep was in fact darker than Andrew, a black Englishman of West African heritage. Andrew responded to this farce in kind by using his own color picker.
You can't go back and forth with arguments that stupid, you know. You got to be like, okay, I'm not gonna say, you know, come on. This is the only way I could respond to that. Do you know what I mean? It's like that the game we're playing now, find the lightest pixel or the darkest point and say that my reconstruction. He actually said his reconstruction, word for word, he said that his reconstruction was darker than me.
Wow.
you should see, he had a picture of me on his response, and he said, look, my reconstruction is more dark skinned than you. I was like, what? I was like, what?
Joking aside, why is Andrew so confident when he reconstructs the pharaohs as indigenous black Africans? Well, that might have something to do with anthropological study after study proving this fact. studies like those of Oxford's Gay Robbins, which classed the skeletal structures of the pharaohs as clearly negroid. After examining a sample set of pharaoh skeletons, Robbins said this, quote, "The limbs of the pharaohs, like those of other ancient Egyptians, had negroid characteristics, in that the distal segments were relatively long in comparison with the proximal segments," close quote, and, quote, "Their physical proportions were more like modern Negroes than those of modern whites," close quote. Andrew of the King's Monologue fame broke it down some more.
She has a 1983 and a 1986 study done on New Kingdom pharaohs exclusively, so not random Pharaohs, yeah, actual pharaohs of the New Kingdom, where she's looking essentially at the limb proportions. So this is kind of like getting an understanding, or at least, yeah, basically that whole difference between tropical, or at least that's what Dr. Shamaka Keita calls it, tropical limb proportions, which she calls negroid limb proportions, and cold adapted limb proportions, which she calls white limb proportions. And there are very distinctive differences once again between native Africans, and once again we're looking at ratios amongst the population as opposed to isolated individuals, but ratios amongst the population versus, you know, Africans versus, let's say, you know, white as a comparator. So these differences are that basically Africans have longer distal segments. The distal segments are the extremities that are the bones that are furthest away from the center of the body. So arms, the tibia bones, that's kind of like your shin bone area, and so those parts of us are longer, which is why we have skinny calves. Okay, and why we have a advantageous reach. You know, if you get two boxes that are the same height and the same weight, one's white and one's black, who's going to have the longer reach?
That's of course the black guy.
The black guy, always. Normally about 3 or 4 inches. Okay, and
I noticed that from boxing. I actually noticed that when I started watching boxing.
Yeah, that's almost that. I wouldn't say it's 100% of the time, but I would say 99.9% of the time, black people will have a reach advantage. That's a clear difference in anthropometric proportions. We also have a shorter torso. That's African body proportions. Europeans tend to have longer torsos and shorter distal segments, which is why they have naturally bigger calves, okay, and kind of like shorter kind of arms. That's the natural differences. And then Asians are even further extremities. So when it comes to like Far East Asians, they have even shorter distal segments and even longer torsos. Something that's the kind of like Denisovan contribution. But anyway, we won't go into what causes it. Well, basically, long and short of it is ancient Egyptian pharaohs fall into the negroid limb proportions. Okay, Amenhotep III and Tutankhamun happen to be two that perfectly, not like almost marginally, but I mean perfectly fall on the line of best fit for negroid limb proportions. In other words, if you saw them and they were in front of you, their bodies would present as the bodies of native Africans.
Let me just ask you, do you know what pharaohs were actually used in that study? But the skeletons of which pharaohs were used in that study?
Yeah. Do you want to read them out?
Yeah, go on, please.
Amos, Amenhotep I, Thutmose I, Thutmose II, Thutmose III, Amenhotep II, Thutmose IV, Amenhotep III, Smenkhare, Tutankhamun, Seti I, Ramesses II, Meneptah, Seti II, and Siptah.
Wow, that's a who's who.
Well, it's the New Kingdom. Yeah, it's the male New Kingdom lineage there, essentially.
Wow. And that's and on studying those mummies, she literally said the word super negroid. That's incredible.
They have to understand that they are now in the fringe. Yeah, we're actually Black Egypt is actually what it is. It's a I'm going to use the word gagged, you know, but it's a muffled mainstream narrative. That's what it is at the moment. I.e., Egyptology academia know they can't really argue with Black Egypt. Do you understand what I mean? So they've kind of Egyptology, the academic side, they've already kind of relented, and they're kind of like, yeah, the ancient Egyptians were, yeah, they were black. You know, it's definitely they were black. But at the moment, they are being muffled and they're being silenced because Egyptian antiquities, Zahi Hawass, your favorite guy, will blacklist you. He will ban you. He will stop you from doing digs. He will literally end your career. You know, as an Egyptologist, you rely on access to Egypt, don't you? Do you know what I mean? And if there's one guy out there who you know is going to destroy your career if you say anything about the ancient Egyptians being black, it's kind of like that's how they are keeping academia, you know, on a leash at the moment. That's kind of what's being done.
I'm not going to lie, that was a fun rant to listen to. If you want to hear it in full, the unedited live interview is available on the Trill Black YouTube channel now. But it was at this point I asked the King's monologue, what about genetics? Haplogroup DNA tests are often bandied around by those who claim the ancient Egyptians were more closely related to modern Middle Eastern populations than continental Africans. But these tests have been widely criticized as disingenuous by geneticists. I asked the King's monologue whether these haplotype DNA studies are in fact helpful.
It's not useful for understanding someone's biology. Perfect example, the fact that we had a discussion at the very start of the stream about the fact that one of the most racially disruptive geneticists out there at the moment, Johannes Kraus, has got Y-DNA lineage that matches most Nigerians. Yeah. So not useful for understanding someone's race at all. Yeah. However, it can be when analyzed with correct anthropological data, which is something that these geneticists like to miss out. It can be useful for kind of understanding how people moved historically. And I think nothing more than that. In terms of understanding one's biology, you have to look at autosomal DNA, that is the entire DNA lineage, and kind of see where that clusters you. And I think personally that you can't get a more useful tool for clustering people in populations than using STR databases or STR profiling. And that's what was used by DNA tribes with the New Kingdom lineage. That was New Kingdom lineage data that was published by Hawass in 2008. They took the data that Hawass published, they ran it through their own STR database, and it was their own one. And they found that the New Kingdom lineage DNA clustered incontrovertibly close to Great Lakes Africans, followed by Southern Africans, followed by West Africans, followed by and by the way, those top three groups were substantially, by several factors, like closer than the next group, which was Horn of Africa. I know that might surprise some people, but this is what their DNA said. So the order was Great Lakes Africa, South Africa, West Africa, Horn of Africa, and then North Africa after that, and then obviously the other places, which were just tiny trace probabilities.
People have criticized you on your coloration. Some people have said it's too dark. These people are too dark. I agree they're black too, but this is too black. Bro, defend your work.
Here's the thing, yeah? So we all know what we're going to get from white supremacy. Let me tell you what we get from black people is a lot of the time we get people who want me to make something. And actually, I was going to do a live stream about this. I'm so glad you asked this question. You know, everybody wants me to make a certain type of black people, and they have to understand something. I'm not making a certain type of anything. I'm making something that looks like the artwork. Okay, the artwork is my guide when it comes to this, and people don't realize, and I think a lot of people who make these comments, they don't understand African phenotypes. So you remember I said earlier, yeah, for instance, that Habesha people tend to have a small maxillary region. Yeah.
Yeah.
They tend to have a small, it's quite a thin maxillary region. So they'll that kind of like area just above their top lip will tend to be quite thin. This is a phenotype, okay? It's an expression of something that makes people look like something. Do you understand what I mean? So when people look, if someone comes up to you and goes, "Oh, you look Kenyan," or "You look this," or "You look that," there's a reason they're saying it. Do you understand what I mean? We're all black, but there's something that they're calculating which makes you look like a certain type of black person, and it's not your complexion. We know that already. Do you know what I mean? So when you don't do art and reconstructions, and Nydia will kind of like double up with this as well, or any person who does reconstructions, when you don't do reconstructions, you don't understand what these differences are. The consistent things about Amenhotep III's statues, for instance, is that he has a wide face. Okay, he has a very quite strong and pronounced zygomatic region. Yeah, so you can see his cheek. Can you see? So he's got these really sharp cheeks. These are consistencies he has throughout all of his statues. Yeah, he has quite relatively large and wide set eyes. So this one here shows a really young Amenhotep, and you can see a young Amenhotep here. Okay, this one here, you can see he's more kind of like mid-20s, and you can see it's the same person tracking through age. And if you can catch the right statue at the right age, and you could tell that this was a young Amenhotep because his head, his proportions are slightly different in terms of the size of his head in relation to his body. You could tell that he was about 14, 15 here. And lo and behold, you do the reconstruction and it kind of matches a 14, 15-year-old. Okay? You get an older, more portly Amenhotep III here. So you can see in the different ages and the different kind of like weight ranges, I'm approximating the same human being. I'm not changing him. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'm not changing him. I'm approximating. It's the same human being. By the way, I'm aging him up and down using AI, and that's it. So I've done one reconstruction here that I've changed the age using AI, and lo and behold, I'm pulling up his younger statue. You know, so I'm starting. This was the reconstruction that I kind of started with. This age over here. Yeah. I make him slightly older and fatter, and he looks like that statue. I make him younger, and he looks like that statue. Do you think that that's a coincidence?
Have you been surprised by the success of your work? Because I think some of your videos have done 1 million views or something on these reconstructions. I mean, at least anyway, in totality across TikTok and all the different socials that you're on, you've hit the millions in terms of impressions.
Obviously, I know my shorts have done very relatively well. Every now and then, I still have a short that will go semi viral. But all in all, I know my channel's like completely suppressed now, so it's a little bit annoying, to be honest with you. I would like to be able to reach more people than the amount that I reach currently. Good segue onto the fact as to why I'm releasing my book as well. You know, just to have more presence and more people aware of Africa's great and very obvious contributions as well. You know, that's really what is important. Like, and I just want it to be a really good book for people's library who are passionate about Black and African history. Go to that link, which is tkmedu.com. That's my website /book launch. It will take them to this page, and they can just click on the button here that says join the pre-sale.